Amidst the lavish wedding, the black bride was suddenly hit in the face with the wedding cake by the groom for reasons unknown. What happened next would leave everyone in shock. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories your way. Thank you. Laurel Morris adjusted the pearl earring dangling from her ear, her fingers steady, her heart anything but. The mirror in front of her reflected an image she barely recognized. A woman draped in ivory satin, her dark skin glowing against the beaded bodice, her hair swept into an intricate updo meant for a fairy tale. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This was a business deal, wrapped in silk and sealed with a kiss that would mean nothing. She exhaled slowly, willing the knot in her stomach to loosen. It didn't. The knock on the door came sharp, precise, like everything in her mother's world. Taylor Morris stepped inside, her gown a deep emerald green, her presence regal without effort. Behind her, Edward Morris, ever composed, ever calculating, surveyed the room with quiet approval. "You look perfect," Taylor murmured, smoothing a hand over the delicate lace on Laurel's sleeve. Laurel held her mother's gaze in the mirror, searching for something. Reassurance, perhaps. A sign that this wasn't the mistake every cell in her body screamed it was. Instead, Taylor only smiled. "Everything is going as planned." Laurel swallowed the bitter taste rising in her throat. Of course it was. This was never about love. The Morris name had been built from the ground up, brick by painstaking brick, by a family that refused to be overlooked. Her parents had clawed their way into a world that had been designed to keep them out, had turned innovation into influence, had made their wealth undeniable. But money alone wasn't enough to buy a seat at the oldest tables. Legacy mattered. Bloodlines mattered. And that was what Andrew Randolph's family had to offer. The Randolphs were old money. Faded, yes, but old nonetheless. Their estate, their name, their position in society still carried weight, even if their bank accounts told a different story. They needed financial salvation. The Morrises needed history. Laurel had always known what her role would be. She had sat through the negotiations at the long mahogany table, sipping champagne while her father discussed investments, while Andrew's parents spoke of tradition, while her mother made sure everything was wrapped in the illusion of romance. "You and Andrew are a strong match," Taylor had told her later, as if reciting a fact. "He's educated, well-mannered, and from a respectable family." Respectable. Laurel had bitten down on her response, on the questions clawing at her throat. Had her mother not noticed the way Andrew's compliments came rehearsed, the way he dismissed Laurel's ambitions as passions rather than serious endeavors? Did she not see how his smiles never quite reached his eyes? Or did she see and simply not care? "Love fades," her father had said, pragmatic as always. But power lasts. And so, here she was. The grand staircase stretched before her like a gilded path to her future. Below, chandeliers cast golden light over a sea of well-dressed guests. The air was thick with perfume, expensive cigars, and the sound of soft laughter wrapped in false sincerity. Andrew stood at the altar, waiting. He looked as he always did, tailored, polished, his dark hair combed back with precision, handsome in a way that was meant to be admired but never truly known. Laurel's grip tightened around the bouquet in her hands. She descended the staircase one step at a time, each movement deliberate. Every eye in the room followed her, murmurs of admiration drifting through the air. She had been trained for this. Poise, grace. A perfect bride for a perfect arrangement. Andrew's gaze met hers as she reached the altar. He extended his hand. She placed hers in his, her fingers cool against his palm. There was no warmth there, no silent reassurance, just an agreement, sealed in front of witnesses. The officiant spoke, but the words blurred in her mind. Promises of forever, of devotion, of love. Meaningless. Andrew slid the ring onto her finger, the band cold, weighty with expectation. Her turn. She lifted his hand, pressed the ring into place. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. And in that moment, Laurel understood. This wasn't just a business transaction for him either. This was ownership. And suddenly the weight of her choices felt heavier than the gown she wore. Laurel traced the rim of her untouched champagne flute, her gaze settling on the man she had just married. Andrew moved through the crowd like he was born for it, slipping from one conversation to the next with the ease of a seasoned politician. Laughter followed him, hands clapped his shoulder, and every so often, an older businessman would lean in, offering words that made him nod in that slow, deliberate way of his, measured, calculating, always aware of how he was being perceived. She had expected distance between them tonight. She had even prepared for it. What she hadn't expected was how natural it would feel for him to pretend she wasn't there at all. The celebration sprawled across the grand ballroom of the Randolph estate, its towering glass windows reflecting the golden light of chandeliers, casting a glow over guests draped in wealth. The air was thick with the scent of aged bourbon, fresh roses, and the quiet hum of conversations teetering between pleasantries and hidden agendas. Laurel had smiled, shaken hands, played her part. But now, standing near the fountain at the far edge of the room, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. And it was there, in that moment, that she heard them. A pair of older men, business associates of Andrew's father, stood just a few feet away, their voices hushed but careless. They weren't whispering. Men like them never needed to whisper. "Smart move on his part," one of them said, swirling the dark amber liquid in his glass. "Tying himself to the Morris Empire." The other chuckled. "That girl's got the kind of money that'll keep the Randolph name relevant for another century. He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband, but he's getting an investment." Laurel's fingers curled around the stem of her glass. She had always known. Hadn't she? In some unspoken way, she had always known. But hearing it like this, spoken so plainly with such easy certainty, it stripped away the last, fragile remnants of the illusion. This wasn't a marriage. It was a merger. And she was the asset. "You know, I was hoping I'd be wrong about him." Laurel turned to find her brother, Louis, standing beside her, hands tucked into his pockets. His tuxedo was sharp, effortlessly tailored, but unlike the other men in this room, he had no need to posture. He was younger than Andrew, younger than most of the men circling tonight, but there was a quiet confidence in him that demanded attention. "I wanted to give him a chance," Louis continued, his voice measured. "Figured maybe he had some redeeming qualities buried under all that privilege." He tilted his head, studying Andrew across the room. "But no, he's exactly what I thought he was." Laurel exhaled, steadying herself. "It's done now." Louis scoffed. "Is it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she let her gaze drift back to Andrew, who was standing too close to a woman she recognized all too well. Eleanor Hastings. An old flame, or perhaps not so old. Eleanor leaned in, whispering something against the rim of her champagne glass, her smile sharp, knowing. Andrew laughed. Laurel lifted her glass to her lips, not drinking, just holding the cool rim against her mouth, letting the moment settle into her bones. Louis let out a slow breath beside her. "He's going to regret underestimating you." She lowered the glass, turning to him. "I don't think he's thought about me long enough to underestimate me." Louis smirked, but there was no humor in it. "That'll be his first mistake then." Laurel had almost left it alone. Almost. She had nearly convinced herself to let the night play out, to do what was expected, to smile, to endure, to wait for the moment she could retreat to the sanctuary of her private suite. But then she heard him. Not across the ballroom this time. Not in some whispered exchange between men who thought themselves untouchable. She heard him in the cigar lounge. The space was exclusive, reserved for men like Andrew, men who believed in legacies, in bloodlines, in the quiet transactions of power. Laurel hadn't meant to stop outside the arched doorway. She had simply been passing by. But then she caught his voice, smooth and practiced, wrapping around a sentence that made her breath still in her chest. "Smartest move I've ever made," he was saying. His friends chuckled, the deep, knowing sound of men who understood the weight behind those words. "You make it sound like a business deal," one of them teased. Andrew shrugged, and even without seeing him, she could picture the expression he wore, relaxed, confident, as if none of this mattered beyond what it could offer him. That's what marriage is, isn't it? Something inside her went quiet. Not anger, not betrayal, just a cold, clear understanding. She had known all along, but hearing it, so careless, so devoid of hesitation, was different. The weight of the night pressed down on Laurel like an iron hand. She moved through the ballroom with the same practiced grace she had carried all evening, nodding when expected, offering polite smiles where necessary. But inside, something had shifted. The words she had heard in the cigar lounge still echoed in her mind, curling around her ribs like a tightening vice. A business deal. A transaction. A calculated move in a game she had never agreed to play. And yet, she had still walked down that aisle. The Randolph estate gleamed under the glow of chandeliers, the opulence of old money and carefully curated appearances. The wedding reception had reached its peak, glasses full, laughter filling the air, music swelling with the false promise of celebration. At the center of it all, the wedding cake stood like a monument. 5 towering tiers of flawless white and gold, delicate sugar flowers curling around its edges. The kind of cake meant for royalty, meant for fairy tales. But Laurel had long since stopped believing in fairy tales. She stepped toward the table where the cake awaited, her fingers resting lightly at her sides. The crowd shifted, gathering in anticipation of the next grand moment, the ceremonial cutting, the first act of unity between husband and wife. A tradition, a performance. Andrew was already there, waiting. His smile was still in place, but she saw the tension in his jaw, the flicker of something beneath the polished surface. He extended his hand, and she took it, her fingers steady, her pulse like ice. The silver knife gleamed under the soft lighting as their hands moved in unison, slicing through the pristine layers. Applause rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. And then came the real test. The moment when they would feed each other the first bite, a symbol of partnership, of mutual care. Laurel lifted a small piece onto the fork, measured, precise, and raised it toward him. Andrew accepted it, chewing slowly, his gaze locked onto hers. Then it was his turn. She saw it before it happened. The way his fingers curled just a fraction too tight around the cake. The way his lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smile. A choice made in an instant. A decision fueled by anger, by ego, by the humiliation of a deal that hadn't gone the way he expected. The realization struck her the same moment the cake did. Thick, sugary frosting smeared across her cheek, clinging to her lashes, streaking the delicate lace of her gown. A collective gasp rippled through the room. For a moment, it was as if time itself had frozen. And then, silence. The kind that stretched, suffocating and unbroken, pressing against the walls of the grand ballroom. Andrew had expected laughter, expected amusement, expected that the crowd would brush it off as playful, as endearing, as part of the show. But no one laughed. Not her family, not his, not the esteemed guests who now shifted awkwardly, murmuring under their breath. Even the orchestra, which had been playing a soft, elegant tune, faltered, a single note hanging in the air too long before fading into nothing. Andrew's smirk wavered. Laurel didn't move. She didn't raise a hand to wipe the frosting away, didn't react with the fiery outburst he had likely anticipated, didn't give him the satisfaction of breaking character. Instead, she simply stood there. And in that silence, in that refusal to play his game, the power shifted. Andrew cleared his throat, glancing around as if waiting for someone, anyone, to break the tension, to turn this into the harmless joke he had intended. But the only thing that met him was the weight of 100 disapproving stares. From across the room, her father, Edward Morris, stood slowly, his face unreadable, but his presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the space. Taylor Morris, ever composed, remained seated, but there was steel in her expression, a quiet, lethal kind of fury that needed no words. Lewis, standing near the fountain, took a single step forward, his jaw tight, his gaze locked onto Andrew like a hunter sizing up his prey. Andrew shifted on his feet. It was just... But the words died before they could fully form, suffocated by the weight of what he had done. Laurel inhaled slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch just a moment longer. Then, with a measured grace that had been drilled into her since childhood, she turned. She walked away. Not a single word, not a glance back. She let the frosting remain on her skin, let the delicate white lace of her gown carry the evidence of his mistake. Because that's what it was, a mistake. A moment of arrogance that would cost him more than he realized. The air inside the bridal suite was thick with the scent of orchids and vanilla, a stark contrast to the tension simmering beneath its grand chandeliers. The silence here was different from the one downstairs. In the ballroom, the hush that followed Andrew's humiliation had been sharp, suffocating, an unspoken verdict passed down by a crowd that had not expected to witness a public disgrace. Here, in this private space, the silence was heavier, not from shame, but from the weight of a decision already made. Laurel stood in the center of the room, her wedding gown still stained with frosting, the remnants of Andrew's arrogance clinging to her skin like a final insult. She had not wiped it away. She had not needed to. The message had already been delivered. The knock came, firm and deliberate, before the doors swung open. Taylor Morris entered first, her emerald gown flowing with each measured step. Behind her, Edward followed, his presence commanding, his sharp eyes scanning his daughter as if searching for hesitation. He would find none. "You don't have to go back out there," Taylor said, her voice smooth, composed. Laurel met her mother's gaze, holding it steady. "I'm not going back out there." Edward exhaled through his nose, a sound that was neither relief nor frustration, just understanding. His voice, when he spoke, was even. "Then it's done." Not a question, not a discussion, a statement. Taylor nodded, her expression unreadable, though there was something in the way her fingers traced the lace of Laurel's sleeve, an almost imperceptible softness in her touch. "We'll take care of everything." Edward turned to his wife. "Pull the funding." Taylor didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Already in motion. The words settled between them like a final nail in a coffin. Laurel had known this would be the outcome the moment she turned her back on Andrew and walked away from that cake table. There had never been another path, never been a chance for reconciliation. Not after what he had done, not after what she had heard him say in that cigar lounge. She had given him every opportunity to prove he was more than what people assumed, that he saw her as more than an investment, more than a trophy to be placed in his family's crumbling estate. And at every turn, he had confirmed what she had feared. She had spent months convincing herself that respect could replace love, that a carefully constructed alliance could offer something close to happiness. But Andrew had never respected her. He had wanted to own her, to absorb her into his life like a financial asset, a means to an end. That was no marriage. A sharp knock sounded again, but this time, it wasn't from her parents. The doors swung open without invitation. Andrew. His tie was loose, his carefully sculpted composure slightly cracked, though not broken. Not yet. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, and that belief still clung to him, even now, even after what had just happened downstairs. His eyes flickered between the three of them, assessing, calculating, searching for leverage that no longer existed. A slow smirk ghosted across his lips, but there was tension in the set of his jaw. I assume you're all here to discuss how to overreact properly. Laurel didn't move, didn't react to the bait. This marriage is over. The smirk faltered for the briefest second before he recovered, stepping further into the room. Come on, Laurel. You're not actually going to let a little joke ruin everything we've built. She tilted her head, studying him the way one might study a chess piece before deciding whether it was worth keeping in play. What exactly have we built, Andrew? His fingers twitched at his sides. A life. A future. His voice was measured, careful, as if he believed she just needed to be reminded of the benefits. We're stronger together. You know that. She inhaled slowly, deliberately. You mean you'd be stronger with my name attached to yours? With my family's resources propping up yours? His jaw tightened. That's not what I said. No, she agreed, but it's what you meant. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a short, humorless laugh. Jesus, Laurel, are you really going to stand here and act like you didn't know what this was from the beginning? He gestured vaguely between them. You were never some naive girl being swept off her feet. You knew what this was. It was a smart arrangement. A mutually beneficial deal. His voice lowered slightly, taking on that smooth, coaxing quality she had heard him use in business meetings. And it still can be. You and I, we can fix this. Let me talk to the press, reframe the situation. Say you overreacted or, hell, say I did, and that you forgave me. We give it a week, and no one will care. By the time we get back from our honeymoon, it'll be old news. Laurel just looked at him, not speaking. His confidence flickered again, just briefly. Come on, Laurel. You don't want to do this. She didn't blink. I already have. Something in his expression cracked then. Not fully, not yet, but the foundation had been shaken. She could see it in the way his fingers curled into fists, the way his posture stiffened, the way his jaw clenched as realization settled over him like a weight he hadn't expected to bear. There was no salvaging this, not because of the scandal, not because of public perception, but because he no longer had control. For the first time in his life, Andrew Randolph was powerless, and he knew it. His smirk disappeared entirely. This is a mistake. Laurel held his gaze, her voice quiet but unwavering. The only mistake was believing I'd let you own me. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Andrew exhaled sharply, shaking his head, but there was no winning move left for him to play. He turned on his heel and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. The moment the door slammed shut behind Andrew, Laurel turned to her mother. We leave tonight. Taylor Morris gave a single, sharp nod, already calculating the steps ahead. Edward, standing near the fireplace, didn't question it either. He had never been the type to waste time on unnecessary words. This wasn't just a matter of pride. It was strategy. I'll have the car ready, Taylor said, glancing at her husband. Make sure our people know the terms. No financial ties. No negotiations. Edward pulled out his phone, already making the call. His voice, steady as ever, carried the weight of finality. It's done. Laurel exhaled slowly. It wasn't relief. There was still too much left to unravel. But it was the first step. Across the room, Louis stood with his arms crossed, watching her carefully. Unlike their parents, he wasn't calm. He was seething. We need to control the narrative. Laurel met his gaze. I know. He pulled his own phone from his pocket, his fingers already moving. Consider it handled. That was the thing about the Morris family. They never reacted. They moved. Quietly, decisively, with precision. And tonight, they would move fast. Downstairs, the wedding reception continued, but the energy had shifted. Andrew could feel it. The laughter had thinned, the congratulations had grown quieter. Conversations that had once been warm were now edged with something colder. People who had clapped him on the back earlier in the night now barely met his eye. He had spent his life in rooms like this, mastering the subtle art of social power, and tonight, for the first time, he felt it slipping. The moment Laurel had walked away from that cake table, something in the air had changed. He was losing. His father's oldest business partners no longer lingered in conversation. A senator he had been speaking to earlier now stood with Edward Morris instead. Even Eleanor Hastings, the woman who had always hovered too close, had disappeared. Andrew's jaw tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. His fingers clenched around the glass of whiskey in his hand as he scanned the room. Laurel was nowhere to be seen. Neither were her parents. Neither was Lewis. Something cold slid down his spine. No. He turned sharply, his feet moving before his mind could catch up, weaving through the guests, ignoring the whispers that had begun to curl around him like smoke. He pushed through the grand hallways of the Randolph estate, past waitstaff and security, until he reached the doors of the bridal suite. He didn't knock. He pushed inside and found it empty. The room was silent. The air still carried the faintest trace of perfume, of orchids and something sharper, something like finality. The bed remained untouched. The vanity, where Laurel's wedding jewelry had been placed earlier that evening, was bare. She was gone. Andrew stood there, his breathing slow and heavy, his grip tightening around the doorknob. He had underestimated her. For the first time in his life, he was the one being left behind. By the time Laurel reached the hotel, it was already past midnight. She sat in the back of the black SUV, the city lights flashing past in streaks of gold and silver. Taylor sat beside her, silent but steady. Edward, across from them, was on another call, ensuring that every legal string was cut before morning. Louis was the first to break the silence. "We should go public now." Laurel's fingers hovered over her phone. She had spent years curating an image, a woman of poise, of control, of calculated movements. She had never been impulsive, never reckless. But this? This wasn't an act of recklessness. This was strategy. She unlocked her phone, typed out a single message, and pressed send. No one can respect a man who does not respect his own wife. This marriage is over. Simple, direct, devastating. Within seconds, notifications began flooding in. Laurel exhaled, setting the phone aside. It was done. The war had begun. By dawn, the headlines had taken over. Scandal at the Randolph wedding. Laurel Morris walks out. Billionaire heiress humiliated. Marriage ends before the honeymoon. Exclusive footage. Groom publicly embarrasses bride at reception. The video of Andrew shoving cake into her face had spread like wildfire, and with it came the consequences. Randolph Industries stock took a hit. Investors began pulling out. His carefully maintained relationships with politicians and CEOs grew strained. No one wanted to be associated with a disgraced man. And Andrew Randolph? He had just learned a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Randolph estate, once a symbol of quiet opulence, was now drowning in chaos. Phones rang non-stop, the sharp trill cutting through the tense air like a warning siren. The household staff moved in hushed, anxious steps, as if trying to avoid the inevitable fallout. The Randolph name had carried weight for generations, an institution built on legacy, power, and the quiet assurance that their influence could weather any storm. But no storm had ever looked like this. Andrew's mother, Eleanor Randolph, stood near the grand fireplace, her fingers trembling as she held the latest newspaper. Laurel Morris walks away. Randolph family in crisis. The headline burned into her vision, the betrayal of it seeping into her bones. Across the room, Richard Randolph, Andrew's father, was pacing, his normally pristine composure cracking. "She humiliated him," Eleanor muttered, gripping the paper tighter. "She humiliated us." Richard stopped pacing long enough to shoot his wife a sharp look. "No, he humiliated himself." His voice was low, controlled, but the weight of disappointment clung to every word. "That stunt at the reception, It wasn't just reckless, it was stupid. Eleanor flinched but said nothing. Andrew had always been their golden boy, the perfect image of an heir to the Randolph name. But last night, he had turned himself into something far worse, an embarrassment. And the Morris family? They weren't just walking away, they were burying him. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple before turning to his assistant. "Get Edward Morris on the phone, now." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, Now." The call was placed. It was declined. Another call. Declined again. Richard's grip tightened around his glass of whiskey. "They won't take your calls," the assistant said carefully. "No one will." That truth settled over the room like a heavy fog. The Morris family had already moved on. Andrew hadn't slept. He had spent the night making phone calls, reaching out to the media, pushing back against the tidal wave of headlines that had painted him as a man unworthy of power, unworthy of respect. The press had once been on his side, had written glowing articles about his charm, his business acumen, his status as one of the most eligible bachelors in the country. Now, they turned on him. His usual contacts, the reporters who had once been eager to spin his narrative, weren't answering. The few that did pick up sounded cautious, detached. "I don't know what to tell you, Andrew," one of them had said. "This story, it's got traction. People saw what happened. There's footage. It's everywhere." Andrew had gritted his teeth. "Then fix it." A long sigh on the other end. "I don't think it can be fixed." That had been the first crack. Then came the next. Randolph Industries stock continued to drop. Investors pulled out in numbers he hadn't anticipated. The carefully cultivated image of the untouchable Randolph family was unraveling, thread by thread. And the worst part? None of this would have happened if Laurel had played her part. If she had smiled, wiped the cake from her face, laughed it off like any good wife would have. But she hadn't. She had walked away, and the world had followed her. By afternoon, the fallout had reached a new level. Randolph Industries lost one of its largest contracts, an exclusive deal that had been in negotiations for months. More partners backed out. Meetings were canceled. Calls went unanswered. His father called him 3 times. He ignored them all. He had one move left. Laurel. She didn't seem surprised when he showed up. The penthouse suite of the hotel was as pristine as ever, the scent of fresh-cut flowers lingering in the air. But Laurel sat in the center of it all like a queen at rest, her presence commanding without effort. Andrew had expected anger, had expected fire. Instead, she looked at him with nothing. No rage, no satisfaction, just quiet indifference. He hated that more than anything. Andrew took a slow breath, steadying himself before speaking. "We need to talk." Laurel didn't respond. She simply crossed one leg over the other, waiting. "I'm willing to fix this," he continued, keeping his voice even. "I'll do the interviews. I'll take responsibility. We can spin this. Say it was just a misunderstanding. You and I both know the media loves a redemption arc." A small, humorless smile tugged at the corner of her lips. A redemption arc. He clenched his jaw. "We built something, Laurel. You can't just—" "We built nothing, Andrew." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the space between them like a blade. "You wanted a merger, a transaction, a trophy." She tilted her head, studying him the way one might study something they had once considered valuable but now realized was just another useless artifact. "Tell me, do you still think marriage is just a business deal?" His fingers curled into fists. "That's not fair." Laurel exhaled softly, as if she were tired, as if this entire conversation was a waste of her time. "What's not fair is thinking you could own me." Andrew stepped forward. "You don't have to do this." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I already did." He felt the finality in those words, the weight of them settling in his chest like lead. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about the fact that he had lost, and there was no coming back from it. Andrew took a step back, running a hand through his hair, his frustration barely contained. He wanted to fight, to argue, to make her see reason, but there was nothing left to say. Laurel watched him for a long moment before standing, smoothing the fabric of her dress. She walked to the door, pulled it open, and waited. A dismissal. Andrew's pride burned, but there was nothing left to do but walk away. As he stepped past her, she spoke one last time, her voice calm, unwavering. "You dug your own grave, Andrew." Laurel had never cared for the spotlight. She had grown up in a world where power moved in silence, where decisions were made behind closed doors long before they ever touched the public. Her parents had built their empire with precision, ensuring the Morris name was spoken with respect, never scandal. But now the world was watching her. The interview had been carefully planned, orchestrated to be neither an attack nor a defense, but a statement, a single undeniable fact. Laurel sat poised in the studio chair, the soft glow of studio lights casting a golden sheen over her skin. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist known for his sharp, unrelenting questions, studied her carefully. But she remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression steady. Then came the moment, the question everyone had been waiting for. "If you could say one thing about the situation, about what happened that night, what would it be?" Laurel didn't hesitate. A marriage without respect cannot survive. Simple, unapologetic. A truth spoken not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been expected to endure. The words settled over the room, heavy with meaning, and in that instant, she felt the shift. Not just in her own story, but in the way the public would see it. She had not been abandoned. She had walked away. And that made all the difference. The interview aired that night. By morning, it was everywhere. Headlines dissected it, social media echoed it, and suddenly, Laurel wasn't just a woman who had left a marriage, she was a symbol. Women reposted her words, their captions carrying their own stories of broken vows and quiet sacrifices. Public figures praised her strength. Journalists analyzed the power shift in high society. And Andrew Randolph? His name was no longer spoken with admiration, but with disdain. Back at the Morris estate, Taylor Morris stood at the window, her manicured fingers tapping idly against the stem of her wine glass as she watched the news unfold. "She handled it well," she murmured, her tone unreadable. Edward Morris, seated across from her, merely nodded. Of course she did. They had raised their daughter for moments like this, not for scandal, but for control. And now the entire world was learning what they had always known. Laurel wasn't a victim. She was a force. And forces didn't break. They expanded. It didn't take long for the business world to adjust. Laurel's name, once tied to Andrew as his wife, now stood on its own. The same investors who had once entertained deals with Andrew Randolph now reached out to her. The same social circles that had whispered about her wedding now welcomed her as an independent power. Andrew's former allies, the men who had laughed with him at the cigar lounge, who had toasted to his brilliant marriage, were suddenly harder to reach. Their phone calls went unanswered, their invitations left unacknowledged. No one wanted to be associated with failure. Andrew Randolph had spent his life believing in legacy. That name had once meant something: power, respect, untouchability. It had opened doors before he even reached for the handle, ensured deference in every boardroom he entered. But power was a fragile thing. It was never about wealth alone, never about birthright. It was about perception. And now the world saw him for what he truly was, a disgraced man. The first real blow came when he was called to an emergency meeting of the Randolph Industries board. He had expected frustration, maybe even anger, but he had not expected the complete and utter removal of his influence. He sat at the long mahogany table, the same one his father had sat at for decades, his tie slightly loosened, but his posture still holding the last remnants of his arrogance. Across from him, The faces of men who had once toasted to his future now stared at him with cold calculation. The chairman, an older man who had known Andrew since he was a child, cleared his throat. "We've made a decision." Andrew straightened. "About what?" "You, Andrew." A pause. "You're out." The words hit harder than he was willing to admit. He leaned back, forcing out a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous." The chairman didn't flinch. "It's already done. Effective immediately. You'll step down from all decision-making roles. We can't afford any more instability." Andrew clenched his jaw. "I built this company." "No," the man interrupted, his voice sharp. "You inherited it. And you let your own recklessness bring it to the edge of collapse." The room was silent. Andrew glanced around, looking for an ally, but the faces that met his were indifferent, unmoved. No one was going to save him. By the time he left the building, Randolph Industries had a new interim CEO, and Andrew, he had nothing. The social exile was almost worse than the professional one. For years, his presence had been mandatory at every gala, every high society function, every exclusive business retreat. His name had been on the right guest lists, his company sought after by the right investors. Now, silence. Invitations dried up overnight. Old friends were suddenly busy. Calls went straight to voicemail. The final blow came when he showed up, uninvited, to a charity event in Manhattan, an event that just months ago he would have been seated at the head table. That night, he wasn't even let past the door. He had walked up to the entrance, straightened his cuffs, prepared to flash the same smile that had once guaranteed entry anywhere. But when the host saw him, something shifted. A slight hesitation. A quiet exchange with security. Then, "I'm sorry, Mr. Randolph, but we're at capacity tonight." A polite lie. A public humiliation. He could hear the whispers as he turned away. "Did you hear what happened to him? He lost everything. Laurel Morris destroyed him." He clenched his fists. He had no one to blame but himself. The financial collapse came swiftly. Without Morris Investments propping up his ventures, everything crumbled. Andrew had never been the financial genius people assumed him to be. He had been reckless, over-leveraged, spending more than he could afford to maintain the illusion of control. When the first cracks in his reputation appeared, the banks hesitated. By the time the full scandal hit, they pulled out completely. Loans were called in. Investment deals collapsed. He sold off assets at a fraction of their worth just to keep the vultures at bay. But vultures never waited long. It took 6 months for Andrew Randolph to go from a man with a fortune to a man barely keeping his head above water. One by one, the symbols of his old life vanished. The penthouse in Manhattan? Gone. The private club memberships? Revoked. The last of his company shares? Liquidated. At 35 years old, Andrew Randolph had nothing left. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be powerless. Laurel had not thought about Andrew Randolph in months. The world had moved on. Her name, once tied to his in wedding announcements and scandalous headlines, now stood alone. And it flourished. She sat in her private office, the glass walls giving her a panoramic view of the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting gold and amber streaks across the steel and glass of Manhattan. Her new venture, Morris Strategies, had launched just 3 months ago. It was already being hailed as one of the most promising firms in the country. No one spoke of her as Andrew Randolph's ex-wife anymore. She had rewritten the narrative. Her assistant entered, placing a tablet on her desk. "You might find this interesting." Laurel picked it up. It was an article, one she hadn't been looking for, but one that found her anyway. The Fall of Andrew Randolph, once a power player, now a cautionary tale. She scanned the first few paragraphs, taking in the familiar name, the sharp words dissecting his downfall, the way the world had turned him into a lesson. A year ago, she might have felt something: pity, bitterness, satisfaction. But now Now he was nothing more than a footnote in her story. She set the tablet down, reaching for the glass of wine on her desk. She took a slow sip, savoring the crispness of it, the quiet power of this moment. Then, without hesitation, she swiped the article off the screen. Gone. The past had no place here. Her assistant cleared her throat. "Your next meeting is in 5 minutes." Laurel nodded, rising to her feet. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, smoothed out the fabric of her dress, and stepped forward, toward the future she had built for herself. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on, each one a reminder that this was her world now. And this time, she owned every part of it. Laurel Morris's journey is one of resilience, self-worth, and transformation. At the start, she enters a marriage built on power and status rather than love, believing she can navigate it with dignity. However, her wedding night exposes the harsh truth. She was never seen as a partner, only an asset. Instead of succumbing to humiliation, she chooses silence as her greatest weapon, walking away with grace rather than reacting in anger. This single act shifts the power dynamic entirely. Her journey from betrayed wife to independent powerhouse is both inspiring and deeply empowering. She does not seek revenge. She simply reclaims herself. By refusing to be controlled, she forces the world to see her not as a victim, but as a force in her own right. Andrew's downfall serves as a stark contrast. A man who thought power was his birthright but lost everything due to arrogance. His collapse is a reminder that respect and integrity outweigh wealth and status. The story's greatest lesson is that self-respect is non-negotiable. Laurel teaches us that true power comes from knowing your worth and walking away from anything that diminishes it. She does not need to destroy Andrew. She simply rises beyond him. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.